Hello, Petal. How are you doing? How are things? My hugest, sincerest apologies for the delay. It's been a bit of a week. Had a bit of a run-in with some antihistamines, new antihistamines that weren't the best choice. So that knocked me out for a couple of days. That was not fun. So I'm going to do my very best not to be so flaky over the next couple of weeks, because we're nearly to the end of this series. Please, if you would, let me know if there's any other Tom Holt books you'd like me to do specifically. Otherwise, we have got suggestions for other book series that we could potentially do. We can also continue on with the Robert Rankin series, and there's just a lot to choose from. So if you would like to leave in the comment a book that you'd like or an author you'd like, and what we'll do is we'll tally them up, see who's got the most votes, and then we'll expand on it to a series. But obviously, if you want me to continue with Tom Holt, I am more than happy to do so. Anywho, please excuse that my voice quality is not yet at its best, but it will be. I promise. I'll just keep drinking the hot tea. And please let me know in the comments how you're doing. How are things going? How is everything? And if you do like the chapter, if you could hit the like button, hit the notifications bell, share and subscribe if you want to, that would be amazing. But obviously that's your choice, that's up to you. So if you could let me know how you're doing, if you could let me know if you've got any suggestions of authors, or if you want me to carry on with what we're doing. Don't forget, this is as much your channel as it is for me, because we're all in it together. So let me know. And as I said, please excuse the voice quality today, but we're getting there. So, Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Sausages, J.W. Wells and Co. Book 7, the chapter of the tennishness. The tennishness. Well, it's nearly June, and that is the time for tennishness. Tangent. Okay, grown up time. Chapter 10. Mr. Goggarty glanced at his watch. There are any number of mail-order catalogues where you can buy fancy watches. Titanium cased, extra shock-proof, special forces approved, with all manner of wonderful functions that only James Bond could ever find a use for. Mr. Goggarty's watch didn't come from one of them. It was built by Fine Workhouse of Scholl back in the days when people really knew how to make stuff. It was small, plain to the point of austerity, with a blue steel case, white face, thin spring steel blue hands, and 3 dials. That was the whole point. Mr. Goggarty's watch, one of only 9 ever made by the greatest watchmaker the world has ever seen, told the time in the present, the past, and the future. The middle dial told him it was 5:15, and he breathed a sigh of relief. The sat-nav built into his phone, Beckmesser and Schmidt of Augsburg, 100 years before Marconi was born, but that's a whole other story, told him he was where he needed to be. 47 New Road, Sidmouth, Devon, standing in front of Speedy Clean Dry Cleaners, established 1975. The last bit made him smile. A special trade-only grin that about a dozen people in the whole world would have understood properly. Narrator sidebar, 1975's my favourite year too. I shall continue. Right, he said to himself. Here goes. He pushed the door, and a little bell rang as he walked into what looked like every ma and pa dry cleaners he'd ever been in. From Reykjavik to Tierra del Fuego, there was a counter, well used rather than shabby, a rack behind it, half filled with carefully lynched garments in their blue polythene shrouds, a till. If this was, as he suspected, the fulcrum of multiple intersecting realities, there wasn't exactly a lot to see. Mr. Goggarty, however, knew better than to rely on appearances. A man, late middle age, short, thinning grey hair, thick lens glasses, a beige cardigan with carefully patched elbows, carpet slippers. But Mr. Goggarty, who treated the chimeras and manticores as though they were badly trained Yorkshire Terriers, took a step back as he approached. The man was positively saturated, marinated in chronomorphic resonances, enough to trigger a Brigadoon syndrome big enough to dislocate San Francisco. He tried to pull himself together, but his voice shook a little as he said, Mr. Williams? The man hadn't been expecting that. almost as if nobody had called him by his name for a very, very long time.
"That's me," he said. "My name's Goggety. Is there somewhere we can talk?"
Mr. Williams frowned.
"How do you mean?" "Privately, where we won't be disturbed."
Confusion. Apprehension. Mr. Williams tensed up like a clenched fist.
"You from the council?"
"Yes," Mr. Goggety replied.
"Oh, I need to ask you some questions," Mr. Goggety said, "about this shop. You understand, I'm sure."
Mr. Williams nodded as though he had lead bricks taped to the back of his head. Something he'd been dreading for a long time was about to happen.
"You better come through to the back," he said. "Just a tick."
He edged past Mr. Goggety and turned the sign in the window to closed.
"We're in trouble then."
Deep breath, because he was about to do something rather mean and cruel, though clearly it had to be done.
"I'm sure we can sort something out," he said, "but you're going to have to be completely honest with me. Do you understand?"
Mr. Williams nodded.
"I'd better call Eileen," he said. "I suppose you'll be wanting to talk to her as well." "Not necessarily," Mr. Goggety said. "It may be possible to keep her out of this if you really try hard and cooperate."
A flicker of hope behind those burning glass lenses, and for the first time Mr. Goggety was grateful for the unique accident he'd suffered a few years back, as a result of which he no longer showed up in mirrors. Looking himself in the face wouldn't have been a comfortable experience.
"You think so?" "No promises," Mr. Goggety replied. "But like I just said, it really all depends on you."
The back room was comfortable, the way a pair of shoes is comfortable a month or so before it's only fit for the bin. Constant use had bent, strained, creased and warped everything in it to the shape of a routine that hadn't changed in a very, very long time. Mr. Goggety lowered himself into a tired but faithful-looking chair and took out a notebook and pen.
"First things first," he said. "Full name and date of birth."
George Edward Williams, born in war and brought up in bombed-out streets, spoke slowly, calm as a steer waiting in a stall in a slaughterhouse. He told Mr. Goggety how he'd used his redundancy from the tyre factory to start up the business, how it had been everything he'd ever wanted, until the day came when everything changed. He described it all, looking down at his feet or his hands, from the first terrible morning right down to the visions he'd seen in his downstairs toilet earlier that day. When he'd finished, he looked up and said,
"That's all there is to it, really. We didn't mean anybody any harm."
And Mr. Goggety, who'd seen it all and learned the hard way never, ever to get personally involved, silently vowed to put things right for Mr. Williams and his wife, or die trying.
"I see," he said. "Now, I'd like you to take a look at this photograph and tell me if you recognise this man."
Mr. Williams peered at the picture of Mr. Huas, then nodded firmly.
"Oh, I know him," he said. "He was in the paper the other day." "But have you ever seen him in the flesh, so to speak?" "Oh, yes, he was in here not so long back. We were in London. He came in with a coat, nice quality, decent bit of material, nice bloke, polite."
Mr. Goggety's throat was at the nullarbor in high summer.
"Can you remember," he said, "if there was anything in the pockets?"
Blank look, then suspicion began to seep in. Mr. Williams might be placid by nature, well, he had to be, to have stayed sane all those years, but he clearly wasn't stupid.
"Don't think so," he said. "Why? What's that got to do with anything?"
"It's very important," Mr. Goggety said, and managed to stop himself, adding, "Trust me, because anyone as smart as Mr. Williams would instinctively know that anybody who says, 'Trust me,' is likely to be about as trustworthy as a petrol station watch."
"Are you sure you can't remember? You seem to have remarkably good memory."
Mr. Williams frowned.
"Yes," he said. "Matter of fact, I do, which is a bit funny," he went on, "because before, well,
He paused, and a very slight shudder passed through him.
"I had a very bad memory. Eileen used to make jokes about it. Memory like a tea bag, she used to say. But not nowadays," he said. "I couldn't remember stuff now like it was yesterday."
Of course he could. Mr. Goggerty didn't explain, because to all intents and purposes, every day since the initial temporal excursion was yesterday.
So,
He pressed on.
if there had been something in this man's coat pockets, you'd remember.
Might do. Very suspicious. Any moment now, he'd ask for ID, which wouldn't be a problem, of course. Mr. Goggerty carried identity cards for all major intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and 90% of them were quite genuine.
But anyhow, he went on, if there had been, we'd have given it back to him. We're very particular about that.
Mr. Goggerty nodded.
Of course, he said. I expect you've got a system for when that happens. Oh, yes.
Mr. Williams leaned back a little in his chair, knowing he was on safe ground.
Anything that's left in a pocket, we put it in a plastic bag with a job number on it, in a box, under the counter, next to the ticket tray. Then when a customer comes in to collect, we always check the box before we hand the garment back, just to see if there's a bag with that number on it.
That's a good system, Mr. Goggerty said.
Never had any complaints,
Mr. Williams replied.
Well,
he added sadly,
we never get any complaints about anything, because we're always gone the next day. But we're very careful about our customers' things. Got to be. Position of trust, you see.
Quite, Mr. Goggerty said.
But just supposing, and I'm not implying anything, this is just for argument's sake, just supposing there had been something in that coat pocket and for some reason you didn't give it back, then there's a good chance it'd still be in your box, right?
Mr. Williams didn't like the question at all.
Well, I suppose it might be, yes, but like I just told you, we're extra specially careful about our stuff like that. And 99 times out of 100, we'd remember anyway without needing to look.
Suddenly, Mr. Goggerty's throat was very, very tight, forming the next words he spoke made the tendons in his neck rub against each other like cables.
Maybe we should just go through your box to make sure, he said.
He'd blown it. Mr. Williams' forehead crinkled up like paper in a fire.
You did say you're from the council, he said.
That's right, trading standards and planning. Mr. Goggerty pulled out his card wallet. Zauberwerk AG of Holstadt, only 4 made, and then they had to blow up the whole valley just to seal the rift. Flicked through and found what he was looking for. East Devon District Council, and a photograph of him looking as though he'd just been taken down off the gallows.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist, Mr. Williams, he said. This is a very serious business. Naturally, I don't want to have to involve the police, but...
The P word. Does it every time. Here was a man who'd just watched 2 knights beating each other up with swords over and over again in his toilet and could still function normally, but threatened him with the police and he fell apart.
The British,
Mr. Goggerty thought.
God bless them. Maybe you could ask your wife if she can spare me a moment, he said. No, that's all right.
Mr. Williams' eyes closed just for a moment.
Come on through.
It was just a box. Once it held 24 packets of Walker's crisps. Mr. Williams put it down on the counter, then started looking in the book for the ticket number. Someone was banging on the shop door. Some poor fool whose laundry was hanging on the rail, presumably. Mr. Williams looked up, but Mr. Goggerty shook his head.
There you go,
Mr. Williams said.
Ticket number 776598. It'll be on the plastic bag if it's there.
The search didn't take long. There were only 5 bags in the box, and none of them had that number on it. Not that Mr. Goggerty needed to look. If it had been there, he'd have felt it through his fingertips like gripping a wet electric fence.
That's fine,
he said wearily.
Sorry to have bothered you. Not there,
he thought, and took a small black disc, a little smaller than a pound coin, out of his shirt pocket, slipped it into the palm of his hand and clenched his fingers around it, which meant that either his entire hypothesis was wrong, or else it had left Mr. Horse's coat pocket and somehow found its way.
Can you tell me, he said, looking away, anything about the other customers who left stuff to be cleaned the day that that the man whose picture I showed you came in? Just basic information, he added.
Throwaway voice. No big deal.
Just names and addresses, that sort of thing.
Mr. Williams looked shocked and scared.
I don't know, he muttered. I mean, it was a long time ago. No, it wasn't, Mr. Goggerty said pleasantly. Also, I'm sure you make a note of that sort of thing. Seems to me you've got a really impressive routine going here. Very orderly and methodical. I imagine you write down all the names and addresses so you can be sure people get their things back. If they don't come in to collect, for example, before you move on. A conscientious man like you, I'm sure you take a lot of trouble over that kind of detail.
He smiled. All teeth and predator DNA.
You don't strike me as the computerised type, so it'd either be a book or index cards. Or well,
like watching a very small giant trying to carry the weight of a very large planet on his shoulders. You could see him gradually buckle and give way.
Book,
Mr. Williams said.
There, on the counter, the blue one. You'll have to excuse my handwriting. No problem,
Mr. Goggerty said. He was already standing over the book, reaching for it.
Let's see, he said. Date order. Well, we know the date. Here we are.
He ran his finger down the list.
10 customers.
Not a particularly busy day. Mr. Huas had been the 5th. While he was at it, he pressed the locator device he'd palmed earlier onto the underside of the counter.
I'll just take a picture of this page, he said,
slipping his phone out of his inside pocket.
There, all done. Thank you very much. You've been extremely helpful.
Mr. Williams frowned at him.
That's it. For now,
Mr. Goggerty said.
I may need to talk to you again. How will you find me? I haven't got a clue where we'll fetch up next.
Another of those smiles.
Oh, that won't be a problem.
Nor would it be, with the handy 5D transponder unit clinging to the underside of the counter like a Borg limpet.
Is there...
Mr. Williams tried to look him in the eye, but couldn't quite manage it.
Is there anything anybody can do? To stop it, I mean.
Mr. Goggerty shivered, but not so anybody would notice.
No promises, he said, but there may be. If I can, I will. I'll give you my word. Thanks. Don't thank me yet,
Mr. Goggerty said.
We're not out of the woods, not by a long chalk. Still, there are various approaches we can try.
Mr. Williams swallowed hard, almost like someone choking back tears.
I feel better just for knowing someone else knows about it, he said. It's been difficult, keeping it to ourselves this whole time.
Difficult. What word to choose? The kind of pressure required to crush everything he must have been through into difficult would be enough to turn a red giant into a black hole. Mr. Williams went with him to the door, unlocked it, even opened it for him.
I'll be in touch,
Mr. Goggerty said, as he stood with one foot on the carpet, the other on pavement.
Will you? Oh, yes. You couldn't...
Big spaniel eyes.
You know, give us a clue where we're going next. Sorry, Mr. Goggerty replied. Rules, you know. Oh, right. Hope you don't mind me asking.
What an appalling existence, Mr. Goggerty thought, as he walked away. Like, what would happen if the TARDIS's navigation system got replaced by the computer that runs baggage handling at Heathrow? The theory that was gradually building in his mind would explain most of it, fitted 90% of the established facts. If it proved to be correct, it was all Mr. Huas's fault. Maybe he could nudge Mr. Huas into a nice, neighbourly ex gratia compensation payment when it was all over. When? If. Before anything fuzzy and heartwarming could happen, however, he had to do the job he was being paid for, and his best and only lead was the watch of digital information stored on his phone. The customers had brought clothes in to be cleaned on the same day that Mr. Horse took in his coat. Plain, ordinary investigation, simple legwork, Rockford Files stuff. He found a low wall to sit on, took out his phone and called up the picture he'd taken of the page of Mr. Williams's book. He concentrated on the first name on the list. The first name was Kevin Briggs. Now, she understood protocol the way a fish understands water. All good lawyers do. It's the element that gave them birth and nourishes them. from which they came and to which they will ultimately return. This morning, however, she was hopping mad. So instead of knocking and waiting for Alan's reedy "come" to filter through the woodwork, she clubbed the door with the heel of her hand, twisted the handle as if killing poultry, and burst in. Alan was on the phone. She scowled at him. He flinched as though she'd just hit him, but carried on with his call. Angrily, she dropped into a chair and started picking at the frayed upholstery. He wasn't the most sensitive man on the planet, but he had the good sense to wind his call up quickly and put the phone down. "Rachel," he said. She raked him with a glare. "Where were you last night?" she said. The sort of question no fiancé likes to have staring him in the face first thing in the morning. Luckily, his conscience was clear.
"I had a late meeting at Burridge's,"
he replied.
"Why?"
"I rang you at 11.
"I didn't get home till gone midnight."
"Your mobile was off."
"Like I said, I was in a meeting."
She took a deep breath and let it go, and with it went a certain proportion of her rage. "The most extraordinary thing happened last evening," she said. "That's why I was trying to get hold of you."
"You should have left."
He didn't bother to complete the recommendation. Rachel didn't leave messages. He had an idea she saw it as a sign of weakness.
"What happened?"
Her frown deepened. "I met this mad woman," she said. "Total nutter, and Kevin has disappeared." Item. One silver lining, Alan didn't say. If his future brother-in-law really had vanished off the face of the earth, it would be a sweet, beautiful thing, and a cause for lasting joy. Highly unlikely, of course.
"Oh?"
he said. "I found the mad woman in Kevin's flat."
Figures,
Alan thought. Any woman would have to be mad to go there, or at least utterly desperate.
"New girlfriend?"
She shook her head so fiercely it was a miracle she didn't centrifuge her brain. "She claimed she works here," she said. "You don't have to be mad to work here," Alan was tempted to argue. Wisely, he did not.
"She doesn't, I take it?"
"Of course she doesn't. Listen," she added, and told the story. Being a lawyer, she knew how to pick out the salient facts and arrange them in due order. When she'd finished, she had his undivided attention.
"That's mad,"
he said. "The disturbing thing is," Rachel went on, "how much she knew about me. Obviously, she has been in my office more than once, quite likely."
"One of the cleaners?"
"Doubt it. I know all the cleaners by sight. I'm usually here when they come round, after all." Rachel was a great one for working late. Until she joined the company, Alan had held the coveted last man sitting award for voluntary unpaid overtime. These days, he was not in the running.
"You're sure you didn't recognise her?"
"Of course I didn't. Don't be ridiculous." She picked a pencil off his desk, broke it in two and dropped it in the bin provided. "You haven't seen anybody hanging around the place lately, have you?" He shook his head.
"She could have been here for a meeting," he suggested. "There's people in here all the time."
"Not roaming around the place, sneaking into people's rooms," she snapped. "And anyway, why would anybody want to do something like that? It's not like I'm a movie star or TV presenter or anything. It's weird." Alan racked his brains for some useful contribution he could make.
"Have you noticed if anything has gone missing?" he asked. "Not anything big, necessarily. That's what stalkers do, I gather. They just like to take things. Underwear, mostly, but—"
"Shut up, Alan. You are not helping," Rachel said with a shiver. "And I'm not in the habit of keeping my knickers in my desk drawer, thank you so much." She frowned thoughtfully. "Actually," she said, "stuff has been disappearing lately, but it's the sort of stuff you don't think twice about. You know, staples and envelopes, rubber bands, that sort of thing."
"That's just being in an office,"
Alan pointed out. "Maybe. Also," she added, "someone keeps making me cups of coffee."
"Ah,
that sounded a bit more like it."
"It didn't taste funny, did it?"
She shook her head. "I assumed it was Pauline," she replied.
"Pauline never makes me coffee."
"Well, No, Rachel replied. She's there to answer the phone and do photocopying, not run a buffet service. I just thought... She shrugged. I don't know, she said. Maybe we ought to involve the police. The look on Alan's face told her what he thought of that idea. What is it about men and not making a fuss until it's way too late? Too late, she thought, and the implications weren't very nice. Oh, we've got to tell someone, she said firmly. After all, if there's a weirdo wandering about the office, we can't just ignore it and hope it stops. Something will have to be done about it. Alan nodded slowly.
You're quite right, he said. Who do you suggest we go to?
She gave him a stern look. Well, she said, I have just gone to you, because you are my head of department. Far be it for me.
All right, he said wearily. I guess I'll have to talk to Mr. Huas about it.
There was more than a hint of fear in his voice. Pathetic, she thought. Chicken. Also, she said, I want you to come with me this evening when I go round to the flat directly under Kevin's. I want to see if that man I told you about really lives there.
Oh, what fun. I don't think that's such a good idea,
Alan said quickly. I mean, what if... Fine. I'll call the police then. She'd trapped him neatly, caught in between his terror of physical confrontation and his morbid dread of getting mixed up in trouble with the police. She was interested, from a purely psychological and sociological point of view, to see which dilemma horn he'd ultimately choose to impale himself on.
Tonight's a bad time for me, he said. I've got this contract I really need to get finished.
She was almost proud of him. It was a valiant attempt. I'll ring the police then.
No.
And for a moment she remembered what she'd once seen in him before they got engaged and love duly atrophied. Takes character to be able to decide instinctively which of two very scary things you're most afraid of. Then you'll come with me?
Yes, all right.
She beamed at him, partly to reward obedience, partly from satisfaction that she'd already trained him so well. Excellent, she said. I'll meet you downstairs at 6:30, and afterwards, she conceded sweetly, you can buy me dinner. On her way back to her office, she reflected on the life choice she'd made when she induced him to propose and decided that it was still valid. True, Alan did look a bit like he'd been shrunk in the wash and inexpertly dried over a radiator. On the other hand, he did what he was told. 5 years of marriage and she'd have him chasing after sticks and fetching a daily paper in his mouth. Back to her office, where she quickly churned through some routine trivia and had a refreshingly bracing run-in with a solicitor from Derby who phoned up to upbraid her for not sending him a copy of some inspection certificate or other. The stupid man swore blind he'd spoken to her only the day before yesterday, and she'd promised faithfully the certificate would be in the DX that night. I don't think so, she replied sweetly. In fact, I'm quite sure of it. What time did you call?
Just after 11,
the Derby man replied.
Got a note of it here, as a matter of fact. Phoned BRHD 11.05 recert, promised in post ASAP, so...
Not possible. She cooed back at him. You see, I'm looking at my diary for the day before yesterday, and it's reminding me that I was in a meeting from 10 till 11:45, so I don't know who you were talking to, but it most certainly wasn't me.
Look, does it matter?
The Derby man sounded thoroughly rattled, which was how it should be.
I need that certificate as soon as possible, or I won't be able to complete on the schedule.
No problem, she trilled back at him. I'll make sure it's in tonight's DX. Slight pause, then, anything else I can help you with, or was that all? When the stupid man had rung off, with a muffled snorting noise that she felt entirely justified in taking as an admission of defeat, she reached across her desk for her diary and flicked forward a page or two, just to remind herself what she'd been doing over the next couple of days. She was about to close the book when an entry caught her eye and made her frown. It was only Lutterworth, 10:30, and she knew Mr. Lutterworth was an accountant from Splice Watershed. Vaguely, she remembered making the appointment, but the entry wasn't in her handwriting, nor was it a hand she recognised. Someone had been writing in her diary. Another point for Alan to raise with Mr. Huas. Better look and see if there had been any further violations. Sure enough, she found another one for next Monday, 9:30, Stephen's assessment. Her eyebrows shot up like oil prices. Stevens, yes, nominally she had an appointment to see Alan to discuss the quality of her work over the past 3 months. It was a regular fixture. In fact, it had been in the course of assessment before last that she'd finally chalked a proposal of marriage out of him. But she'd have written Alan, and she'd have left out the demeaning assessment, and that most definitely wasn't her writing. No, she realised, was it the same hand that had written Lutterworth 10:30 on the previous page? 2 people scribbling in her diary, one of them demonstrably creepy. She scowled horribly and went through the diary page by page. First the future, then the past. When she'd finished, she pushed the diary off the desk onto the floor as if it was crawling with spiders and instinctively wiped her hands on her sleeves. Not just 2 entries in 2 different hands, there were dozens of them, well, 5 at least. Furthermore, and this was the truly spooky bit, there were entries for appointments and meetings which she could clearly remember having made and written in herself, but which appeared on the diary page in handwriting most decidedly not her own, while over her own entries she could practically see herself writing them down. There was no sign. Not even Tippex splodges or the marks of rubbed-out pencil. Finally, to add insult to gross weirdness with intent to cause alarm and despondency, in the useful phone numbers section at the back of the diary, each of the interloping hands had written, in a different colour ink, the extraordinary line, which came first, thee or thee. Mr. Horse woke from a dream of acorn sandwiches and turnip sorbet to find he'd fallen asleep at his desk. He shook himself, rubbed his shoulder against the edge of the desk, and reached for the phone.
Mandy?
Yes, Mr. Horse.
Has Mr. Goggerty called yet?
No, Mr. Horse.
Any messages at all?
Lots. Mandy replied succinctly. Shall I bring them in?
He sighed. Might as well.
Lots was no exaggeration. Restored to life, the post-it notes alone would have been enough for a medium-sized Scots pine. Then there were the printed-out emails and the internal memos. Everybody in the world, it seemed, wanted to talk to him. Actually, not talk to, shout at. One example at random. The site manager in charge of the new Far From the Madding Crowd development, 190 luxury bungalows on the northern edge of Norton St Edgar, had turned up for work at 9 sharp to find that the site was not there anymore. Hares lolloped and raw deer grazed on unsullied pasture where yesterday he'd had a dozen JCBs gouging out footings, and there was no sign at all that he and his men had ever been there. An explanation, please, and were they to forget it or start all over again? Meanwhile, the building inspector who had come out to sign off on the Paradise Regained development was a bit put out because there weren't any buildings for him to inspect. Rather a surprise, since he'd been there a month earlier and they were just putting the roofs on. Had Mr. Horse ordered the demolition of the properties in question, and if so, was he aware that planning consent was required before any such demolition could take place? Those, and a dozen or more so like them, were bad enough. What made Mr. Horse wince, however, was the sheaf of memos from the legal department. 11 of them, all asking the same question about the same property.
Oh, hell,
he thought. He picked up the phone.
Get Goggerty on his mobile, he barked. Now.
His own stupid fault. He was perfectly willing to concede that, but trying to be clever. One scam at a time, his inner voice had yelled at him. But no, he hadn't been able to resist the lure of the extra refinement, the tweak too far. Now everything was unravelling on him simultaneously, and he shuddered to think where it would end unless something could be done about it. Unfortunately, right now, the only person in the world who could sort it out for him was Goggerty, who, when last spoken to, had burbled to him about promising leads and intriguing potential lines of inquiry, translated into English, diddly squat. He couldn't, in all conscience, criticise Goggerty on that score, The job he'd been set was, after all, monstrously difficult. Quite likely, impossible. Looking for a fierce-shifting needle in a polydimensional haystack, blindfold, and wearing wicket-keeper's gloves. The more he thought about it, in fact, the more depressing it became. What if Gogarty failed, and the whole horrible contrivance came apart at the seams? Now, that was the trouble with using technology, for want of a better word, when he had no idea how it actually worked. Absolutely fine when it's running smoothly, but as soon as the little red lights go on and the burning smell gets too rank to ignore, you're in the hands of the repairmen and technicians, and if they don't know how to fix it... Brr, Mr. Gogarty for you.
Put him on.
Mr. Gogarty sounded hassled, which was as unpromising as it was uncharacteristic.
Nothing so far,
he reported.
I'm following up on an angle that might lead somewhere, but it will take time. That's a bit awkward,
Mr. Horse said.
The fact is, I'm under a certain amount of pressure right now. I really do need this business sorted out as soon as possible.
He realised how that must have sounded and added,
I know you're doing your best. Do you need any more resources? Money? No,
Mr. Gogarty said.
It's nothing like that. It's just that I can't be in two places at once. Been there, Mr. Horse thought. Done that.
As for the other way around, that was what had caused all this mess to begin with.
Ah, well, he said. I thought I'd ask just in case. I'm holding you up. I'll let you get on. Call me as soon as you've got anything at all.
No hope there, then. That really only left him with one possible course of action, and it was something he'd wanted desperately not to have to do. He sent for Alan Stevens.
It's, like this, he explained. I need to lay off staff in your department. It's the economic climate. Just not enough work to justify current staffing levels.
Mr. Stevens stared at him. Respectfully, of course, a bit like a senior courtier staring at George III on one of his bad days.
Oh, he said, I was sort of under the impression we were rushed off our feet. Not really, Mr. Horse said. Probably it just feels like it from where you're sitting. The view from my desk is that we need to slim down our operation a bit. In fact, he went on, I'm closing the whole department. From now on, we'll be outsourcing our legal work. That, he added quickly, doesn't include you, of course.
The agonised look on Mr. Stevens' face thinned a bit, but he still looked very sad indeed, like a spaniel whose bone has just been stolen by an Alsatian.
I'll need you to,
If he was outsourcing everything, what could he possibly need Mr. Stevens for?
To, coordinate the legal side of the business and, supervise things, if that's all right with you, of course.
Mr. Stevens nodded so rapidly his head was a blur. Of course, he said, and any worries Mr. Horse may have had about Mr. Stevens resigning in solidarity evaporated like water in a furnace.
I'm sure I'll be up to the extra responsibility.
You had to admire a man like that. Someone with the cool and the vision to turn a narrow escape from the dustbin into promotion. The sort of man you'd want at your side, if only so you could make sure he didn't sneak up behind you with an ice pick.
We'll discuss a new package to cover your, career restructuring.
A pay rise, in other words. Well, why not? For some reason, 30 pieces of silver was the sum that sprang immediately to mind.
Well, he went on with an effort, I'd better let you get on. You've got a fairly miserable day ahead of you.
Have I? Mr. Horse didn't answer, whereupon it occurred to Mr. Stevens that telling the legal department it had just got the sack was to be part of his extra responsibilities. He took it better than Mr. Horse had expected, in that he didn't audibly whimper. Instead, he stood frozen stiff for about 10 seconds, then turned slowly and wordlessly and left the room. Mr. Horse slopped back into his chair, like cheese melting into toast. Nasty business, and he felt truly rotten about it, but at least that was one small part of the mess dealt with. For now. The greater part was out of his hands, only Mr. Gogarty could save him now. Pam and Trevor Macpherson liked living in Norton St Edgar. It was their sort of place. As they stood on their drive at the top of the hill on a Sunday morning, they could look down on an apparently endless vista of salmon-pink bungalow roofs and neatly cut lawns, on an army of neighbours walking dogs, weeding borders and washing cars. If only, they sometimes thought, the whole world could be like Norton. It was the perfect place to retire to, an island of calm, order, homogeneity, and sanity, in a universe of wild men and madmen. The only thing it lacked, Mr. Macpherson had been known to say, was a moat and a drawbridge. Today, however, they had to leave Norton, just for a little while, to drive into Malvern and stock up at Tesco. Under the warm mid-morning sun, they got into the car, waved cheerfully at their neighbours, who waved cheerfully back, and set off down a attractive drive towards what passed for a main road. At the T-junction they turned left, past the massive oak tree, past the track that led to Priory Farm, and found themselves back at the top of the hill outside their house. Trevor Macpherson frowned, checked his mirror, indicated, and pulled over. His wife looked at him. "Didn't we just—" He shrugged.
"Can't have,"
he replied, and drove on. Down Attractive Drive, Mrs. Clayton was pruning her roses, Mr. Burgoyne was painting his windowsills. At the junction turned left, past the beautiful old oak tree in which Charles II was supposed to have hidden when escaping from the Roundheads, though he'd have had a job since it was only 200 years old, past the track that led to Priory Farm, over a slight rise, back in front of their house. His wife scowled at him. "What are you doing?" she asked.
"I'm not doing anything," he barked. "We just—"
"I thought we did." He shook his head.
"We can't have." He drove on, down Attractive Drive, Mrs. Clayton too wrapped up in her roses to look up, Mr. Burgoyne frowning slightly as he watched them go past. At the end of the road, turned left, past the tree, past the farm drive, over the little bump. "This is daft," Mr. Macpherson said. His wife was getting edgy. He could tell. "I don't like this," she said. "Let's go back in the house." The same thought had crossed his mind, but since she'd suggested it, honour dictated that he could not. "Don't be silly," he said. "We're going shopping. All right?"
He drove on, down Attractive Drive, Mrs. Clayton straightening up, secateurs in hand, waved cheerily, but they did not wave back. At the junction, turned left, past the tree, past the farm, over the bump, and— "Stop the car," said Mrs. Macpherson. "I want to get out."
"Shut up,"
Mr. Macpherson reasoned with her.
"All right,"
he said grimly, and drove on, down Attractive Drive. At the junction, turn right. "I thought we were going to Tesco," said Mrs. Macpherson. Through the village, past the church, past the pub, past the site where they were building the new houses, round the sharpish left-hand bend, and there they were again, opposite their front door. "That does it," Mrs. Macpherson said, reaching for the door handle. "I'm getting out."
"Stay where you are,"
Mr. Macpherson commanded as she slammed the door behind her and marched up to the front door.
"Well, fine. Stupid woman,"
he muttered under his breath and let the clutch in. This time he performed a flawless three-point turn, drove up the hill instead of down, over the little bump, out onto the narrow single-track road that meandered its way between tall hedges to the neighbouring village of Bolton. For the first minute his heart was in his mouth, but the road carried on being the road. The familiar landmarks, gateways, overhanging trees, a derelict barn, were all where they were supposed to be, and he gradually allowed himself to unclench a little. He was actually pleased when he met a tractor coming the other way, and having crammed himself into the hedge, he let it crawl by. He wound down his window and hailed the driver.
Excuse me," he shouted. "Have you noticed anything odd?"
The driver looked at him as if to say, "Yes, you."
"Odd?"
"Obviously not."
"Sorry," Mr. Macpherson said. "Forget about it."
He drove on, past the long, wide right-hand curve with the lay-by, past the stack of silage bales, past the track to Priory Farm, past the oak tree Charles II couldn't possibly have hidden in. He stopped. On his right, the mouth of Attractive Drive. He swore loudly and drove on through the village, past the pub, church, new development, round the bend, over the little bump, back to his own front bloody door. He stopped, put on the handbrake, let go of the steering wheel, and began to shake all over. He was still quivering when his wife banged on the window. He wound it down. "Well?" she said. He shook his head. He'd never seen her look like that before. "I tried ringing the council," she said, "but the phone's out of order."
"Try your mobile."
"No signal." 40 years in the road haulage business, 12 of them as regional manager, Mr. Macpherson reckoned he was pretty well bomb-proof, and with good reason. Spilled laws on the M6 hadn't fazed him, nor snowdrifts, Operation Stack, fuel excise duty, not even the French. He knew better than most the risks of setting tyre to tarmac, just as mariners gathered together in dockside bars whispered strange tales about the mysteries of the deep. Hauliers have their own Flying Dutchmen, Marie Celestes, sea serpents, islands that turn out to be giant turtles. They know that geography isn't such a set of absolute constants as they'd have you believe. You'd heard about the Demon Motorway junction in Pembrokeshire that swallows up those unwise to take it, leaving no trace. Of the phantom Lutterworth bypass that only appears for 6 hours every 5 years and leads to a place that nobody who's been there will ever talk about. Of the M25 tailback in 1992 that became so dense it achieved critical mass and collapsed into a black hole. He'd raised more than one glass to honour a driver who'd set off into the vast uncertainty of the highway and never been seen or heard of again. There were worse things out there than feedback loops, and he'd met men who'd faced them down and lived to tell the tale.
"Sod it," he said. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I may be sometime."
"Trevor, don't be so bloody stupid," his wife said, but by then he'd turned on the ignition key and put the car in gear. The last she saw of him was his brake lights as he slowed to a halt at the T-junction. And then he was gone. Mrs. Macpherson went back into the house, made herself a cup of tea, and turned the TV on for her afternoon soap. All she got was a black and white snowstorm. She tried channel hopping, but they were all the same. She had another go at ringing the council, but the line was still dead. She went next door and rang the bell. When a neighbour came out, she said, "My telly's on the blink. Mind if I watch with you?" A shake of the head. "Mine too. I was just about to come round to your house. Can I use your phone? It's not working." They looked at each other, and each of them saw no panic, only resigned, irritable acceptance. Intuitively, both of them knew that whatever strange inconvenience this might be, the root cause must lie with some man, somewhere, trying to fix something he didn't understand, rather than send for a proper engineer and pay the call-out fee. Hence, no cause for concern, since sooner or later the man's wife would make him see sense, the proper authorities would be sent for, and normal service would eventually be resumed. Then an ugly thought occurred to Mrs. Macpherson, and she asked, "Where's Dave?" "He went into town to get some plywood," her neighbour replied. "It's been ever such a long time. Still, once he goes in one of those DIY places, he loses all track of time." Mrs. Macpherson replied that Trevor was just as bad, but her heart wasn't in it. If asked, she reckoned she could advance a pretty good theory about why Dave was so long at the fair. The point was, though, that she hadn't been asked, and it had served no useful purpose to scare her neighbour out of her wits when, for all she knew, council workmen were at that precise moment swinging into action and sorting it all out. Whereupon the roads would be open again, the TV and the phone would start working, and she'd be able to ring the council offices and have a good old moan about why it had taken them so bloody long. Until then, the only sensible course of action was to keep quiet and spirit of the blitz it out. She went home and did some vacuuming. About half an hour later, the electricity went off. Now that, she felt, was taking things just a squidgy bit too far. Unfortunately, there was absolutely nothing she could do about any of it, not unless she fancied trying to walk into Malvern, assuming she could get out of Norton, which she felt fairly sure was impossible. She read a book until it was too dark to make out the words, then sat quietly in front of her silent TV at her stone-cold dead gas fire. Just gone 9, Trevor came home. He was limping and his back was bent. He'd run out of petrol, he'd explained, and he'd had to leave the car at the top of Burridge Lane, which was, incidentally, about as far as it was possible to get before it sent you back home again. And he tried everywhere he went on, every road or lane out of Norton, and it was the same story all over. Eventually, when the petrol gave out, it tried walking up the footpath that wound its way through the woods to Bolton. It trudged on for well over an hour, and he'd been on the point of letting himself hope when he climbed over a stile to find himself back in a attractive drive 2 doors down from his home. "This is no good," his wife told him. "We've got to tell someone." He no longer had enough energy to be irritated.
"They'll find out soon enough,"
he said, dragging off his shoes and collapsing into a chair.
"I expect the electric bean-off's got to get their attention."
"But somebody's got to do something." He looked at her.
"Such as?"
"Oh, you're just useless," she said, storming off and colliding with the rocking chair, and although he felt she was maybe being a bit harsh, he wasn't inclined to disagree. He'd come to the end of his resources when the petrol tank ran dry. All of his life he'd been a man of action, and now he was faced with the depressing fact that there was nothing he could do. His wife, by contrast, was a catalyst. She suggested, urged, mithered, complained until someone else, the properly constituted authorities, took action. But with no phones, no roads by which postmen could come to collect letters, no means of communication whatsoever, she was as ineffectual as he was. They couldn't even have a nice cup of tea with no electric. Still, he thought, it wasn't as though it was going to last very long. By now the outside world must have noticed. Rescue was on its way, and any minute now the lights would go back on, the phones would ring, the roads would reopen, and all would be well. For now, however, he was sitting in the pitch dark, and it bothered him. Without visual stimuli to distract him, he found it hard to keep his mind from coming up with increasingly bizarre and disturbing theories about what exactly was going on. Alien invasions, nuclear catastrophes so violent they'd bogged up the laws of physics, stuff so weird and wonderful he'd never taken any of it seriously for 1 second in the light, but which spawned and grew alarmingly in the darkness. Bugger that, he thought. It'd been a cloudless blue sky day, so the moon and stars would be out. Hardly a substitute for a 100-watt bulb, but surely better than no light at all. He got up and felt his way slowly and carefully to the back door. Outside the night was still and warm. An owl hooted sleepily in the distance. The air was sweet and rich with the heavy scent of lavender and night-scented stocks. But it was dark. He craned his neck to look up at the sky. Clouds, he said to himself. Please let it just be clouds. No stars. No moon.
Oh, so what can be going on here then?
Things are not right at the Circle K. There's strange things at the Circle K. The 90s was such a good era for films that were fun. Now they're all a bit samey. But yes, that's my old lady complaint for the day. So, what could possibly be going on at Norton St Edgar? Things are getting a little bit custardy, aren't they? Just a little squidgy bit custardy. We don't know what's going on, do we? But we will. So it appears there's lots of competing alternate dimensions and little bubbles of reality in different places. And Mr. Horse is having a really bad day, apparently. Yes. So, sorry this is taking me another couple of days to get finished. I do apologise. It is chaos right now. So, yes, haven't been able to find any antihistamines that don't knock me out for the day. And, of course, because I have lots of other stuff that I have to get done, important stuff on the day-to-day, it's all been a bit crazy. So I'll stop whinging and complaining, being flaky, and try and get me arse in gear and get back to where I was. If you enjoyed this chapter, my lovely beans, please hit the like button, hit the notifications bell if you want to be notified of the instant premieres, and if you want to subscribe and share, that is always awesome. Please let me know how you're doing. As I said, I do apologise for the last week of mayhem. The next couple of weeks probably will be mayhem, but I'll do my best for you as always. So yes, I am going to be a bit flaky for the next couple of weeks, and yes, we will try and get our act together and get a bit regular again. So much apologies, but I do appreciate you all very, very much, you lovely beans, and I hope you're all okay, and thank you all for the lovely messages and comments, and I really do appreciate you so very, very much. But yes, let me know how you're getting on in the comments. I hope you have an awesome Monday, and you take it easy and you look after yourselves, and big loves and cuddles and hugs, and yes, take it easy, petals. Oh, we need a tune. Oh my goodness, man. You know when your mind goes blank? Literally, my mind has just gone blank. Hold on a minute, I'm going to need to stop and restart. I love this. I should have maybe put Kids TV theme tune by putting an 80s theme tune. And of course, the natural one to come first is ne 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 ne. Which tune is that? And if you don't know, I will be very surprised. Take it easy, take care of yourselves, and let me know how you're getting on. Take care, Petal.